of the resources to bring resonance, to bring again through conscious awareness, communication, inter dialogue, because the world is moving so fast that has created that alienation. So thanks that human beings, we have a spirit, and there are philosophers and sociologists and the psychotherapists that put these things into practice, health professionals, all kind of people, educators, media professionals. Then we can start to say, okay, so this is what's happening in the world. Okay, so how we can respond, not just at an individual level, but as a humanity. Okay. When we see natural disasters, situations of war, I don't just see the immediate needs, but also the need for healing. Because there will be a time that those conflicts are going to somehow calm down, and then how we are going to heal as a humanity. And that's interesting about logotherapy, social analysis, that is so transcultural that from many countries, and even countries who are in conflict, they have studied the work of Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, independent of politics, or independent of religions divisions, or culture, or civilization divisions. That's what's interesting about the work of Viktor Frankl, that he showed to humanity through his own experience that a person who suffers still has the capacity to be kind, to love. And this is not some kind of illuminated person or some kind of superhuman. It was Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist who was taken to the camps, whose family was killed, and he had that capacity. He's a human like you and I, has that capacity to do that, and that's what brings that kind of inspiration to a lot of people who come across Man's Search for Meaning.
Why knowledge matters. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Edward Marshall. Edward Marshall is a medical doctor and also holds a PhD in neuroscience, and now he is a registered psychotherapist in Ontario, and he's also at the same time a professor in the United States and teaches logotherapy. Welcome, Edward Marshall, to the show. It's such a pleasure having you.
Thank you for inviting me, Yannick. It's a pleasure for me to talk here today about logotherapy and its essential analysis by Viktor Frankl.
It's such a pleasure. You were born in Spain. You went through medical school there, then did a PhD in neuroscience, and ultimately find your way to psychotherapy, which is really fascinating. The path that you have been through. And today, really, you talk about logotherapy, your specialty. But first and foremost, let's start. Who is Edward Marshall?
Well, basically, who is Edward Marshall? I'm a registered psychotherapist, as you said, and I'm mostly working with clients virtually all over Ontario. And I found this an institute of logotherapy here in Ottawa to teach logotherapy, and I teach internationally. I'm originally from Spain, where I went to medical school, and there I first learned about Viktor Frankl and logotherapy in the context of knowing what it means to be human. And then from there, I didn't really know exactly how to apply logotherapy, but as I was working as a family physician, I also completed a PhD in neuroscience, and there I was interested in the connection between the mind and the body, the philosophy of mind. So I further research logotherapy and essential analysis. When I completed a PhD, I had the opportunity to go to the United Kingdom, to England, to study in a program for psychiatry. From early on in the program, I started to specialize in psychotherapy. And there is where I started to really apply logotherapy and existential analysis in clinical practice. It was also known there in the UK for some professors, and it was an interesting area of study. A few years later, I came to Canada, and I've been working as a psychotherapist since then, and further studying logotherapy and getting registered and becoming a teacher of logotherapy assistential analysis. So yes, I divide my day in studying and also reaching out to the community and knowing what's around in my neighborhood and in the country and in the world. And it's interesting with the technology that one can reach out to so many people around the world and from so many cultures. So that's something that perhaps we can talk about today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We have so much actually to talk about you. But first and foremost, what was really the root of your pursuit of knowledge?
Well, that pursuit of knowledge is about knowing the world also, but also to what one can contribute to the world. So before contributing, one needs to get an idea a lot of it, what's going on, and then one realize that there are a lot of things that are still unknown. So that leads towards interest in research. So I was always interested in research, I think, since I was a child, and it stimulates me that research sometimes a bit dry, but there are moments where one finds something new, and that makes it exciting, for me. So that's
What
a
was,
little bit that
how
pursuit
did,
of knowledge. That, as Viktor Frankl said, perhaps at the root of pursuit of knowledge is a search for meaning, and we can elaborate on that further.
how did, and this is a more personal question, and how did your wife help you or support you in the pursuit of knowledge? Because it's also to some extent to do the research that you are doing, it's also very much being in your head, right? It's a lot of thinking. So, how does your spouse support you?
Yeah, so I met my spouse when I was working in England, and she was a psychologist, and she was teaching there, and she also knew logotherapy and existential analysis, so we had that point in common. So since the very beginning, those are conversations we were having about how to apply logotherapy and existential analysis. So it's not just a philosophical subject, but also an applied science. And yes, and over the years, our work became more and more intermingled, and we have done publications together since then. And also in the development of the Ottawa Institute of Logotherapy, we have supported each other. So to start something new in a new city is also challenging, but that's part of the process of the search for meaning. Yeah.
Absolutely. But one thing I also want to know is there's still a gap between a medical doctor, neuroscience, and ultimately becoming a psychotherapist, especially logotherapy. How did you ultimately bring all this together? Walk
Oh yeah.
us through, especially our listeners, through the process. How you ultimately you find like bang, yes, this is what I really want to do, because it's fascinating. Medical school is one of the toughest schools you can go through, neuroscience of course as well, and ultimately you diverge a little bit from the, I would say, the hard sciences a little bit more into the soft sciences. Of course it looks very much complementary, of course, but walk us through, really, through this process.
Okay, yes, absolutely. So when one starts as a medical doctor, one is following mostly what one learns from the teachers, from the professors. Okay, so one is guided by professor, but slowly one starts to develop one's own practice and one's own areas where there are unknowns and things that can be done better. Okay, so how psychotherapy has evolved is tremendously since the 1980s to today. Okay, then even though it looks like you say yes, the hard science of medicine or neuroscience and philosophy look like it's worlds apart. Actually, they are very much in common, and that's one of the things also I have been working on in applied neuroscience. So just to give you an example, is that in any science pursuit, we collect data, no? But that data needs to be interpreted, and what one interprets is based on certain models and philosophies. So it's an interpretation of data. So initially, as a young researcher, I was using models that were given by other people. Okay, and then as I completed my PhD, and I started to develop my own models, and it's very useful because then one can start to see the same data or the same reality from a different lens. And one of the things about logotherapy and anesthesia analysis is a very complete view of the person that doesn't want to leave anything behind, so of the person. So they say, well, we are not just cells or organic matter. We also have abstract thinking, more spiritual concepts such as love or such as kindness or such as hatred. So there are all these things that if one leaves out, one doesn't have a complete view of the person. And so, yes, that's why one of my interests of research has been to integrate the body, mind, and spirit, how all that works together. There are things that we don't still know, but we know that they work together. Okay, so we can start to look at the models that are open to all those human experiences. So that's how I combine it. So yes, so you're very right that perhaps looks like there is a disconnect, but when one looks deeper, is actually very much connected.
What are the fundamental principles of logotherapy?
Yes, well, so yes, as I mentioned, initially to look at logotherapy as a philosophy, that is not very much fashionable today to talk about philosophy, but anyway, everyone develops what's called a personal philosophy, a personal view of the world. Okay, so logotherapy has these principles that first of all is an existentialist philosophy. So it looks at the freedom of will, the freedom of the person capacity to make choices, to have a consent. And I talk about the experience of the freedom of will because this has been contested by neuroscience and philosophy that does really freedom of will exist, so is it a illusion? Okay, all right, but humans, we to function, we need to have that experience of the freedom of will. So that's one of the first principles of logotherapy. The another principle is what's called the will to meaning. Okay, so Freud spoke about the will to pleasure that exists in human condition. Adler about the will to power that what the place in society. But Viktor Frankl, from the very beginning in the 1920s, he started to talk that yes, that there's also this will to meaning, that to make sense of life, to be able to respond to life according to certain values, so and possibilities. That's the will to meaning, and said that that's the most important one because sometimes we might not have will to pleasure or will to power, but it's a resource that's available for individuals even when they are having a situation of illness or disease or calamity. Okay, and then finally another principle is that life has meaning under all conditions, the meaning of life. So what that means is that um, in logotherapy we look at things that happen to people, happen to the world, and then how humans will respond to those events. Okay, so that's why it's always the capacity to respond, and sometimes because of grief, because of shock, because of health disease, a person might not find how I can respond to life. And there's where logotherapy comes in to help individuals to respond to life with what they already have. So those are the main principles of logotherapy that, as you can see, and is is very applicable for practice, not just clinical practice as a psychotherapist, but logotherapy has been applied in education, in businesses, and in many other areas of life. Okay, so those are the main principles of logotherapy and existential analysis.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, especially reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It really comes through how profound this therapy actually is. And I think in general, even Malinovsky was talking about this, Gertz as well, I think in the late 80s or 90s, about, human beings are really meaning making and meaning seeking. We are constantly looking for meaning and ultimately also connecting the dots, right? Ultimately, right? And so this interaction, this constant making and seeking is truly what somehow makes us so unique, right? Of course, we can go back and to some extent say, well, that is um, has an evolutionary mechanism as well, right? When it comes to survival, of course. But there is something very distinct in my view. And reading Viktor Frankl, and especially at the present time where we witness so much of anti Semitism, for example, which is astonishing right now, which is really, really problematic, I truly find his work is somehow unprecedented, at least to me, as so far as I can tell. And therefore I'm so glad that you're willing to talk about it, because it says so much to a man. And I find also very interesting actually your background. um of course, I don't know if I can mention this, but you're also a father of five children, right? So and your wife is also a professor. So I really admire this, and I'm always grateful for people like you who took on the most important job that someone can take on, in my view, and that is being a father or a mother. And I think this too is something that oftentimes gets neglected when it comes to meaning or logotherapy in general, is that the ultimate meaning. And I already know in my somehow in my genes, I know that, even though on one hand it's kind of convenient to believe, well, right now, I don't have the baggage in this sense, right, of children, because it's a huge responsibility, the biggest responsibility in my view that you can take on ever. To me, it's a no-brainer. But if you miss that, okay, if you, let's say, if I will end up childless, okay, I truly believe that there is something that there is missing. Of course, you can always work through, but there is somehow a meaning, a chain that somehow is interrupted, that could potentially have really, really deep consequences. Okay, and we can come actually back a little bit at the end of the interview, but I just want you to comment on that when it comes to meaning, but also the relationship to.
Yes. Yeah, so basically, the search for meaning is universal, but then it manifests in many different ways for each individual. So it's not everybody's unique. Every situation is unique. Some people will have families, some people will have a lot of children, no children, some children. Some people remain single. They say that there are multiple jobs that one can take. Okay,
Exactly.
so the first thing is to know that everybody is unique, and no matter what vocation we choose in life, there are always going to be obstacles and challenges, and then it's how we respond to those obstacles and challenges where we find meaning. It's not so much about having things or trying to find a career, but it's the challenges that we face in that path. So we find that meaning potential, and then also is this idea of Viktor Frankl that meaning is found in the other rather than the self. So that means, for instance, it takes a village to raise a child. Okay, so having children challenges the parents to find that village, to find those resources. That they cannot do it alone. Okay, so because when they face challenges, they need to count on other people. All right. So that's important because sometimes people ask me about Carl Jung and Viktor Frankl. What's the difference? Carl Jung was a student of Sigmund Freud, and he also touched on spirituality and spiritual issues. Okay, so in my view, the main difference is Carl Jung is a lot about the integration of the self, recognizing ourselves as who we are, that we have strengths and we have areas of development. Viktor Frankl acknowledged that, but also said that the person it's important for the person to be integrated with the world, with integrated with the others, and then meaning is not just in the self, but is how we relate to others, how we face the world. Okay, so that's important because every person has a contribution to make, no matter their resources, intellectual resources, or economical resources, or even health resources. Everybody has a contribution to make to that community they're in, and that's where, for instance, that's how logotherapy becomes a science because it's based on testimonials of people's lives. First, started with Viktor Frankl in his book "Man's Search for Meaning," how he responded, offering his skills, his kindness, his values, even in a situation where he was dispossessed of all his resources, even a situation of grief. The same when we see people in a hospital, there are always those individuals who are reaching out to others that makes everybody smile, makes everybody feel welcome at home. So those individuals demonstrate what a person is capable of doing, and logotherapy and psychoanalysis helps the person to reach that potential that they have to be able to be part of something, no matter what their situations in life is. So that's important because that's a process of healing, a process of recovery. Sometimes not just going to the same position as one was before, the say state of health or economic status, but is to be able to adapt to the new situation and to know that one is not alone. There's a community around them. So that's the main characteristic I see of Viktor Frankl's logotherapy in comparison, for instance, with Jungian analysis that is more centered in the self.
Would you recommend, if someone doesn't face any challenges, let's say, but he just feels like that he wants to improve better his life, just in terms of growth, in terms of contributing more, becoming, you know, truly the version that he is supposed to be, would you recommend such a person potentially taking logotherapy, you know? If there is no, medical condition in this sense, would you recommend that?
Well, it is in the sense that people first are searching for something, and many of my clients have already read Man's Search for Meaning or have read my bio, some information about the work we do. So there will be people who already know something about logotherapy, and but then even for people who don't really know about logotherapy, one can apply its principles without really previous knowledge. Previous knowledge. There's an educational component, like in any psychotherapy. But then the important thing is first is to listen to the person, to listen to their concerns, listen to what they have to say, to establish a rapport, a connection. So there's a resonance, there's some kind of a connection with the person. Then listening to them is to see what are the kind of things that they are missing in their lives. And then Viktor Frankl talks about the existential vacuum is when that something is missing in their lives, and they feel somehow disconnected with the world, but then they have a feeling of what's called feeling of meaninglessness. And then for Viktor Frankl, that feeling is not a feeling of disease or pathology, but actually it's a feeling of being human. Because if somebody notices a vacuum that something is missing in their life, they might have, at least unconsciously, an idea what is it that is missing. Mm? Okay, so that's the first thing is to start to validate that feeling, and second, to explore with that person. Okay, so what do you think is missing in your life? And sometimes one doesn't even need to ask that question directly, but through listening to that person, there is a cry for help. There is some kind of something that they are longing for, and then there is where one can engage the person to find that thing that is missing in their lives. Okay, so
Yeah,
that's
that's
the way
beautiful.
to look at this. Is not to impose meaning, or you need to do this, you need to do that, but to listen to the person and to say, okay, so what is it that is missing there? And then from there, one starts to make some kind of dialogue where the person can start to connect with our human being, and then to explore possibilities. I mentioned existential analysis and logotherapy. it's mostly the same thing, but existential analysis, as you say, is an analysis of possibilities. What is it possible for that person? And we will kind of go deeper into that because, say, for instance, a person longs for education, okay? But then education can have many forms. Can be just going to a lecture, taking a course, reading an article, listening to a podcast. Okay, so everybody will have a different way to fulfill that meaning. That meaning lies. So that's why it's important to listen to the person and then do an analysis of possibilities, analyze what is possible, because that's where the person will say, okay, yes, that's something that I can work on, where they are. Okay, so that's how the process of logotherapy starts.
Have you personally always been a good listener?
Repeat again.
Have you always been a good listener?
Listening.
Yeah, have you always been a good listener? Because it seems
Oh,
that
okay, okay. If
you,
I be a good
with
listener,
your
yeah. So
work, you have to be a
yes,
good
yes,
listener.
exactly. Okay, so yeah, about listening, some people have a natural, gifts to be a good listener, but they also can be educated. They are what's called a active listening. Okay, so a good listener could be somebody who's just silent and listening. No, but then beyond that, it's important to reflect back to really help that person know, yes, that they are listening. Okay, is this what you are saying? That's the active listening, and then from the person to say, oh yes, that's what I'm saying, instead of say, oh yes, I understand, but what is it that you understand? One needs to be more specific. That's the active listening, and that's a skill that can be trained. Okay, so and then from there as well is the listening to reflect back, and also to have a dialogue with that person, allow oneself to be corrected by saying, no, it's not that, it's that. Okay, so let us and then until there is a synchronicity and a mutual language. Another thing as well is the meaning of words. Words can mean many things, so sometimes one needs to ask for a clarification. People use metaphors, a lot of metaphors in language. So one needs to ask for a clarification. Okay, what that metaphor means for you, how that applies to your life. So the person really feels that that person is interested, fully involved in understanding what's happening in their lives. So that's what I say. That can be natural gift, but also can be trained.
That's beautiful. What's for you the most beautiful part of logotherapy or psychotherapy as a therapist as you are?
What is the
What's for you the most beautiful part of logotherapy, and being a therapist?
Yes, okay. So the most beautiful part is what I've said at the beginning, is that to look at the whole of the person. Okay, so body, mind, and spirit. So what that means? Okay, so we have a body, we have physiological responses, the stress response, the limbic system, that's our emotional brain. Then we have emotions, we have feelings, we have thoughts. All that is in the psychological domain. But then we have these capacities that is the spiritual capacities in a philosophical sense. That is the capacity for consent, the freedom of will, the capacity of self-awareness to know ourselves, and the capacity as well to see a situation beyond our own interests. We see beyond the self. So there are these capacity of the person to, for example, for love. Love is not just an attachment, or it's just a psychological determinant, but it's also a connection with a human being. And there's all this area of what's called the values of ideals. People have ideals that they have not been uh, lived so far, but it's something about the future. So, for Viktor Frankl, say having ideals is fundamental for a human being, because without those ideals, that person doesn't reach their full potential. All right. So all those are in the domain of the abstract spiritual domain, and how the beauty of all this is that all this is integrated. That's how I develop a model called the principle model of the freedom of will, where what I propose is that there are all these abstract concepts such as love, forgiveness, that they are somehow stored in the brain, and then there is a dynamic in the brain, that the brain can somehow use all these concepts at a more physiological level. And then there's a capacity for the person to self-reflect, to observe the world, and to somehow change the way they have those ideals. Okay, so one can have ideals that are very local, the ideals that are more universal, and that's part of the search for meaning, that human beings are trying to find that universality. What is it that it means to be human? In Congress of Logotherapy, there are people from all over the world, different cultures. It's not about what makes us different, what makes us similar. Okay, so all that is the beauty of logotherapy and existential analysis, that we don't constrict ourselves to a particular culture, but we are trying to look at that universality of humanity, which Viktor Frankl used a term called monanthropism, one humanity. One humanity. Mhm.
Beautiful.
Okay, so I think that's the beauty of logotherapy and existential analysis. Yeah.
Beautiful. Coffee or tea?
Well, I would say tea. I would say tea. Yeah, I'm a soft person. My approach is soft, and what I help to people sometimes become psychologically and spiritually strong. Okay, so the one can have physical strength, and some people say, well, now I'm injured, or I'm in a very good shape, but one can always develop a strength that means leadership. Say, okay, so if you have values, you have convictions, then you can assert your uniqueness. So you can become psychologically and spiritually strong. Okay, so I find tea more in that area, because I sip a cup of tea to reflect, to feel warm. So that's the idea of tea. It represents for me. Yeah.
That's very interesting, and it's actually true, right? Would you say that coffee, specifically because of the caffeine, would you say like tea is healthier than coffee, or is it about the balance? How much? Is it about the quantity, or is it about that literally? Um,
Yes, yes, yes. We try to now, especially in psychotherapy, to know that every verse is unique. Okay, so for some people, coffee is a good thing to have. For other people, it's not their thing. The tea, depending on which tea, how much the tea. So no, yes, I was just using as a metaphor. Okay, so yeah, so it's not one or the other. The other one can be equally healthy or unhealthy, depending on the person. Okay, so the thing is always coming from a health perspective, is always things in moderation. That's a good word to use. That's how it is. But I wouldn't say one or the other healthy. It's just the symbolism of coffee is more an stimulant. It's something that can help us to keep working, help us to keep awake if you had a long day, or help us to wake up in the morning. Where the tea, I always associate it more with having a cup of tea and having a conversation, or having a time of reflection.
what's to you the meaning of life?
Well, for me, the meaning of life is about that. It's about to know that in every situation there can be challenges, there can be obstacles, and in every situation there are ways to respond to it. So, and that was the key of Viktor Frankl and myself. I've been an immigrant. I've been Spain, UK, Canada. There are obstacles, but then there are always ways to respond to those obstacles. And then from the logotherapy point of view, is well, it's not just what I can receive, but what I can give. Sometimes we have in this position, oh, I have nothing to offer and nothing to give. But if one reflects and one has the right people around it, yes, everybody can make a contribution. Okay, so that the meaning for life for me. Okay, so logotherapy was not well known in Ottawa. A few people know it. Okay, so for me, it's meaningful to have an institute of logotherapy, and to say, well, at least in Ottawa, I know that people are going to know logotherapy, but of course, it's Ottawa and beyond. Okay, so yes, that's was the meaning of life for me. As you mentioned, having a family, so for me, that is about also facing challenges, obstacles, but at the same time, the reward to be committed to a long-term project, yeah, to a long-term project. Okay, so all those things, and for me, also is this thing about the long race. So I'm more always looking more at what is it towards the future, the long race, not just the short term, but the long race, and what's coming after, and that has always been for me an important source of meaning, because when one is facing a crisis, it seems that the world is collapsing, but if one say, well, the crisis is just one part of a whole. Okay, so and then say, okay, and then a crisis, for instance, is time, comes from the Latin word time, chronos. And Viktor Frankl has a book in German that is a crisis as time of decision, and that's where it's difficult to make decisions. So that's where the help or the support from others help us to make those important decisions to come out of the crisis, and if possible to come out of the crisis stronger. Okay, so that's the meaning for life for me, and to know, and I would say to all our audience, always to count that there is always going to be some kind of challenge, even in the best conditions. There is always something that's going to be challenging, because then that's gives you a set frame of mind that, okay, so I have the tools to respond to that challenge, and if I don't have them, I can learn the pursuit of knowledge, or I can seek support from other people. So all that is what brings a meaning to my life, not rather than having a particular success, but that's a vocation of participation, contributing, and also knowing that it's going to be obstacles, and we need to face those obstacles. We need to somehow find meaning in those challenges through living our ideals. Okay, so that will be a little bit of a summary of what how I practice this meaning seeking in my life. Yes.
I mean, it's so important, and I fully agree. I think usually always the tough choices equal an easy life. In other words, as you said, obstacles ultimately set you free because it helps you to grow, and because if there is no anything that you need to change, it's really the obstacles that make you change, right? That make you question and to make you really advance, because life is all about movement, right? It's as Heraclitus also said once, you never step twice in the same river, right? That's what life is. And I think these obstacles to some extent are always presented for us to develop, in any sense of the word, whether physically, mentally, emotionally, or socially. And of course, there's also a threshold, of course, especially when it comes to psychological trauma, right? And therefore, it's so important that there are professionals like you who help people who face those substantial crises, because unfortunately, there are people such as, PTSD,
Yes.
people
Yes.
who go to war, for example, because that's why we live in a free country. We live in a civilization where we value democracy, we value those fundamental
hmm
principles, right? We stand on a Judeo-Christian worldview, right? That has enabled us to live now freely, and we can say whatever we ultimately want, which is so
Yes.
important.
Yes.
But I just want to a little bit touch on the threshold, because obviously I always say that yes, all the obstacles I faced, and as anyone does ultimately, it's, I think, to some extent it's always the same, right? It's like, I give you an example. Usually people think like, well, you can just attack a billionaire or whatever, you can just trash him because he doesn't care, because he has so much money, right? But that's not true, right? Everyone has the same basic human identity needs, for example, right? And so a billionaire, let's say, has the same needs as I and you, for
hmm
example, even though our bank account is not as big, let's say. Okay, and so that's always to me so important, that we are also recognizing the fact that it doesn't really matter where you're from. You ultimately you experience whatever trauma, whatever challenges you go through to some extent at the same level, because it's ultimately like evolution that pushes us, right? If you reach a certain level, you always, and this also has to do to some extent, of course, with the search of meaning, right? You want to contribute more. Of course, it can also become pathological, of course, right?
Yes.
When it comes to whatever, it's always, it's an addiction, right, to some extent. That's why it's so important, we have to be always cautious. But please give us a little bit insight why this is also so important, and why is it so crucial in this day and age, because there's so many people who suffer challenges, psychological challenges, and people like you are so in demand. A lot of places in Canada and all over the world, especially also in the West, people can't even get access to those professionals because there's not enough.
Yeah, so there are a few things in what you are saying. Okay, so let me see if I remember them all. Okay, first of all, is that psychotherapy as a science, it has evolved from the 1980s to now, yeah, and even from the year 2000 to now tremendously. The effectiveness of psychotherapy today is nothing in comparison how it was in the 90s or 80s. We have a better understanding of the stress response, how the brain works, the interaction with the mind, and also we have a better understanding of the interaction with the spirit. That's why there's so much demand. It's not just that people are more in need of psychotherapy, but also psychotherapy has improved its methods. The second thing is that to face obstacles and challenges in life, it's important to have knowledge, training, education, and experience. Okay, so there's this concept of resiliency that some people who have worked or been trained or have more experience, they are going to become more resilient in facing life challenges. That's how children and young people are affected the most, because they are the ones that who have less time, less experience, and there is a concept of a stress inoculation, that a child is important a child to face obstacles, but not to the point that it breaks the child. Okay, so that's they are more vulnerable. So one of the things, well, how logotherapy works is that we use other modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy, EMDR, all these evidence-based modalities, because in order for the person to respond to certain life situation, they need to acquire skills if they don't have them. Okay, so the role of the psychotherapy and the logotherapy is also to educate people. It's not so much to give them advice or tell them what to do, but to say, look, these are the resources where you can self-regulate your emotions, where you can calm down your body. These are the resources where you can reflect on what you want from life. What are the resources, how to seek help around you, how to navigate the system. All those things are needed in order to respond. It's not like, well, you're there now, just respond. No, it's a whole thing, a package of things that we can do. Yeah, when we see situations of crisis in the world, there are a lot of sociologists that have been working on this area, and there's this concept of acceleration, where the world is moving very fast. It used to be very slow. Then in the 20th century, it started to speed up, but now it's super fast, and that has created alienation. The people not communicating with each other. So one of the resources to bring resonance, to bring again through conscious awareness, communication, inter dialogue. Because the world is moving so fast that has created that alienation. So thanks that human beings, we have a spirit, and there are philosophers and sociologists and the psychotherapists that put these things into practice, health professionals, all kind of people, educators, media professionals. Then we can start to say, okay, so this is what's happening in the world. Okay, so how we can respond, not just at an individual level, but as a humanity. Okay. When we see natural disasters, situations of war, I don't just see the immediate needs, but also the need for healing. Because there will be a time that those conflicts are going to somehow calm down, and then how we are going to heal as a humanity. And that's interesting about logotherapy, is the analysis that is so transcultural that from many countries, and even countries who are in conflict, they have studied the work of Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, independent of politics, or independent of religions divisions, or culture, or civilization divisions. That's what's interesting about the work of Viktor Frankl, that he showed to humanity through his own experience that a person who suffers still has the capacity to be kind, to love. And this is not some kind of illuminated person or some kind of superhuman. It was Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist who was taken to the camps, whose family was killed, and he had that capacity. He's a human like you and I, has that capacity to do that, and that's what brings that kind of inspiration to a lot of people who come across a man's search for meaning. That's my take on it in talking with people, reading Franco's books. That's what I can say at this time. Yeah.
And you mentioned, I mean, he spent 3 years in the concentration camp, right? And he was able to keep his spirit alive, right? And that's what really saved him, because a lot of people who lost this meaning, right? They ultimately meant also that their health was really, really decreasing, and ultimately, which then they ended up in maybe in the right place, which meant death, right?
Yes.
And so that's why it's so important, and that's why I'm so grateful to you that you share this knowledge, because as any one of us, right? Everyone has a gift, it's a celebration, whatever you believe, whether you believe in a Christian God, in a Islamic, or in whatever it is, right? It's this uniqueness that everyone carries, with himself and herself, and shares ultimately with the world, in order to make this world a little bit better, because I truly believe that everyone has a mission, and it's really the goal is to some extent to really find your gift and reveal it, and make this world better. And that's why I'm so grateful for you, because I can really feel that you have this gift, you were able to reveal it to the world, and now you practice it, you can help people. It's so needed. I think it's truly inspiring. How would you like to be remembered while lying on your deathbed?
Yes, that's a very important question, and it's part of one of the questions that Viktor Frankl asked to himself. Because when we talk about the survival value of the search for meaning, there's a lot of different. We can talk about survival in different ways. Okay, so this is the physical survival, that I don't die physically. Okay, but then there is another survival, that is the survival of legacy, how I would like to be remembered. Okay, so that's the thing. So some people are more explicit to write journals, write books, video recordings. Some people are more in the oral tradition, how they talk to people. So for me, it's important the dialogue with family members, with patients, in the media, like we are doing now. Is to acknowledge, yes, that with all my imperfections, with all my inefficiencies, with all my limitations, I try to make the world a bit better, and I try to make a contribution. Um, Sometimes in with individual people, not so much mass media, but then anything that brings to my life, every person, every area of life. So that's yes, that even with my imperfections, with my weaknesses, I try to do the best I can, and then to live towards those ideals of kindness, towards those ideals of involvement, towards those ideals of acknowledging my limitations. So I take care of myself. So that's in a way how I would like to be remembered. If it's that through the legacy I leave through my books, or through my recordings, or just through the example I give to my kids, or to any friends I have, or any family members. That will be my ultimate wish of how I would like to be remembered. And the and this we were talking about survival value, and also logotherapy and session analysis. Viktor Frankl used it very much in people at the later stages of life. People who have terminal illness, cancer patients who have poor prognosis. And there has been a lot of research done, for instance, in New York at the Sloan Kettering Hospital on logotherapy assistential analysis. And with the outcome measures, it was demonstrated people who participated voluntarily in logotherapy groups, actually, they started to see they are dying as part of their living, a part of the human experience, and uh, using their last day meaningful in the sense of communicating with family members, making amends, giving example even in their pain to other people around them, the nurses. So they have got this quest, and people who really get into this mindset, actually they fare much well in their stages, later stages of life. Okay. So the thing is that not everybody can achieve that. We know that, but at least we can try to help them. We can try to help them to achieve that, because that potential is in every person. Every person. Mhm.
That is so beautiful, and you just touched on death. And to me, really, I think there's so many also theologians, but also Viktor Frankl, and I think the at least to me, it's life is really the preparation for dying peacefully, dying. And I think, if you have your stuff together every single day and you ask yourself, okay, have I lived the way I want to live? And if this would have been my last day, did I do my best? And when I look back, am I, happy? Do I have a smile? And I think this is so important, and I think it completely sets you free, because at the very very beginning, when you were born and when you're already in your mother's womb, it's already basically you're a little bit closer to death, right? And so it is this end, it's this transition for whatever you believe. Some believe it's heaven ultimately, some believe it's just the end. But just having this sense that there is something I'm getting closer, and therefore I have to prepare for it, is to some extent also missing a little bit in our culture. In general, I don't really know what it is, but you touched a little bit about it. And to my last question, and it's really, do we face a crisis of meaning? And you touched about it, because it's so true, right? We face so many, it's so rapid, right? We cannot even absorb it. For example, in myself, I'm really honest in this sense. I am basically not really consuming news, for example, really, really consciously, because I know that it will just turn me really down. It's really tough. Of course, selectively I go and I have my sources, but it's really, really, I'm really cautious about that. But because if not, I am completely determined by my outside world. So emotionally, I'm just not there. I'm really irritated. I cannot function properly. It's the same thing that I don't really put on my cell phone, in the morning at the beginning, for example, because it's just not possible, because I know I can't do, for example, the reading. I can't connect to the people as good as I'm if I don't. So please elaborate a little bit on this,
Yes, yes.
Edward.
Yes, there are a couple of things. First is Viktor Frankl talks about the tragic triad of human existence. No? And in the back in Answer for Meaning, there is a chapter called "The Case for Tragic Optimism," and then there is this tragic triad is about guilt. Sometimes we examine our lives and we say, okay, we have not been our best, but that guilt, rather than consuming us, we can transform it in changing our life for the better. Then we can suffer pain. Okay, so we can transform that pain in doing something important in our lives. Okay, and then the losses is, well, to recognize the value of what we lost, and that value remains, and how we can still live it. So that's the way of the tragic optimism, that even in the midst of tragedy, there's always something that we can do for ourselves and for others. Then the second thing is acknowledge our limitations. Okay, so what are how much we can take on. Okay, so some people who have been more trained, who have more abilities, they can. I use the example of going to the gym. How much weights you use. If you take the bigger weights and you're not trained, you're going to break your body. Okay, so people can take more weight. Okay, so it's important to measure one's own limitation, and that's okay. That's part of being human. That's what I say. That it's part of being human that we have a limitation, and that's meaningful. Not to overexert ourselves. Then the question of the crisis of meaning comes a little bit, yes, from this acceleration and this materialism in our culture. We are fascinated by technology, for instance. No? Okay, so but then human beings will say, okay, so now what do we do with the technology? So and if one is not careful, one starts to use technologies to the detriment of humanity, and you start to use the technology so people don't move, don't do exercise, don't have relationship with in person with people. So even there, the values is important. Whoever creates technological advancements. Okay, so how we can create a technology at the service of the humanity, not technology to sink humanity down. Okay, so all these things that sometimes have been pushed away, the study of philosophy, all that's not practical. As you mentioned, how you can reconcile clinical practice with neuroscience and philosophy actually is super important, because otherwise one is just dependent on what other people say and one doesn't fully understand what's going on. So that crisis of meaning is a little bit of a crisis of philosophy, a crisis of self-reflection, a crisis of pausing, taking a cup of tea, slowing down, and it's a crisis of a dialogue with the other human beings, to having a conversation, time for that. We are so busy doing things that at the end of, we don't have time for ourselves, self-care. So that's the acknowledging of our limitation, and then to live according to our means. You mentioned about the different socioeconomic status. I have the privilege as a psychotherapist, like many other clinicians, but especially now that I work in virtually, I see people from all kind of postal codes, and I can say here publicly that in each neighborhood people have the same problems. They have problems with the separations, they have problem with their kids, they have problem with their water system in their houses. Everybody has the same problems, no matter the socioeconomic status. And then people who actually have a lot of resources, they are always finding, okay, so what I can do with my wealth, because they feel restless if they're just sitting in a hammock and doing nothing. And sometimes that's what you see in the news, that the people say, well, what's how this person goes into so much trouble. They could have just been living a peaceful life in Mexico, or a kind of warm country. But the thing is that you think that everybody has the same problems, and the important thing is to use our resources in accordance to our strengths, and to take the jobs that we feel that we can take. Not to take more than what we can take. That's the part of the self-care. And for health professionals, the same. They need to take time off. They cannot do 3 shifts in a row, 2 days working in a row. They need to slow down, ask for help, look at ethical dilemmas, life or death situations. If one doesn't stop and to acknowledge that one is dealing with life and death situation, slowly the unconscious mind is going to rebel against it. Okay, what I'm doing the right thing. I need to talk to people. Okay, so that will be in healthcare, but it could be in any other profession. And that's what I see with many of my clients every day. So that's what I would say about this. Yes, this crisis of meaning, and also the response of logotherapy. Another thing is, well, that for some logotherapy authors have talk is about the indifference that is in the world. People like saying, well, we have hate and love, but also we have indifference, and how we help people to become more involved, less indifferent. So that's another area where that can lead towards a crisis of meaning, the indifference that people sometimes get into. No? So anyway, so I hope that this conversation will help as well for people to say, well, I have little, but with that little I can do something. And sometimes people do something out of nothing. You talk about making meaning or finding meaning. There's that creative part that is to make something out of nothing. So, and that's one of the things my wife always say, that I always try to make something out of nothing. So, but that comes from the human spirit. There is something actually there already. Okay, so for everybody, just that they have something to contribute, something to say, something to get involved with, and they can make at least the life of their neighbor or somebody around them a little bit easier. Mm? Okay, so that's what will be my message for your last question.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Edward, for your time and truly for your gift. I can tell that you are truly rooted in who you are. Your work is truly, radiates through your face, that you find truly a meaning and purpose in your life. Thank you so much for your time, and especially also to your wife, that she allowed you to take so much time for us and share your wisdom. Truly
Yes,
appreciate it.
and thank you for
Edward
inviting me
Marshall.
and giving me this opportunity.
Edward Marshall. Thank you so much. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.